Hello, welcome to today's episode of The BIM Student. I'm your host Chetna Chauhan. Content creation is one of the most important aspects of BIM implementation. Irrespective of what software you like to work on, BIM content forms the basis of the process. After all, content is a medium through which the information is recorded and transferred. This week, I sat down with two very brilliant BIM content creators and asked them about their strategies, workflows, and challenges when they work on a project and need to create content. My first guest is Beimann, who's BIM Coordination Specialist with IBI Group. He has led many transit, healthcare, and high-rise residential projects and has devised unique content creation strategies to help design teams to meet project BIM goals and optimize their BIM workflows. My second guest today is Navid Hoorzad. He's a design technology lead at Quasar Consulting Group. He has background in MEP engineering and manufacturing and has trained several architecture and MEP professionals to use various BIM authoring software. His software expertise includes Revit, Navisworks, Dynamo, SolidWorks, Mastercam, and MicroStation, to name a few. Let's listen to both of them about their experience with BIM content creation. Welcome to my podcast, Dylan and Navid. I am so glad you guys took out time to talk to me. Thank you.
Yeah, not a problem. Happy to be here.
Thank you, Chetna. Very happy to be here as well.
Quickly, I just want you guys to introduce yourself to my audience.
Hello, BIMwise and everybody on the BIM Student podcast. My name is Dylan Beimann. I work for IBI Group as a BIM coordination specialist with a proficiency in content creation, specifically for Revit architecture, but I've moved into some structural, and I've dabbled a tiny bit with the MEP side.
Okay, and Navid.
Hi, everyone. Well, my background is primarily in electromechanical engineering. I think I probably spend more of my time on the mechanical side. I started my whole BIM journey back in 2008, working at Morrison Hershfield. And there is really where I kind of fell in love with how technology and engineering overlapped. Recently, I've joined Quasar Consulting here in our hometown in Toronto as the BIM manager, primarily implementing design technology services to better our engineering services.
I can't wait to have this discussion with you guys, content creation and BIM. Now, what generally people understand in today's world, content creation is the content creation for internet that we have. But one by one, can you tell me what exactly do we mean by content creation in BIM?
I mean, yes, you could limit it to simply saying that this is something to go inside Revit, but it extends further than that to provide a full workflow around that piece of content. To understand what your end goal is, usually starts off with you needing to have a piece of content. And if this content meets your goals, great, then that whole workflow is solved. But sometimes you need to understand if this content does not meet the goal. There is a bit of a Venn diagram, if you will, between the design intent, the content evolution, and then, of course, does it meet your end goal? With that in mind, you may end up doing several different versions and revising your workflow. And then, of course, that may implement your original intent behind the content. So getting that inward circle until you're right in that middle of that triangle, and you don't have to revise anything further, and you've delivered a perfect workflow, perfect piece of content, and the end user or designer is happy with it.
Well, I definitely agree with that. I would say content creation is kind of a tricky topic because it expands into so much more than just the design sort of umbrella that we sit under. It stretches into fabrication, it stretches into construction, and even within the design, it stretches into all of the different disciplines: architectural, MEP, structural. It almost like it sets the bar for how collaborative you want to be with every other discipline, and really how much you want to take a content to really whether it's going to be not so much as just like a realistic representation of what something looks like, but also look at a data harvesting object where you can look into and be able to pull data from, not just specifically from my perspective as a designer, but as a building operator or as a contractor, or even through a building's demolition. You could still look into it and find metadata that you might find interesting.
According to me, if there is no information, there is no BIM. If there is no data, there is no BIM. You're just looking at a 3D object. So do you think right now where we are with architecture content creation, we are giving as much importance to information, to data as it should be for an optimal BIM process?
I will say that it varies, project to project, user experience to project team, the actual end deliverable, the scope of said little object or grand object, what is it supposed to do? It really depends on, if you have this object and your end goal is here, then you don't really need to go beyond that. That being said, there's always room for improvement, for that modeling strategy to be revised or that content to evolve a little bit further, pack some more data into it. It gets transferred over from me to Navid, and he thinks, well, you know what? I need to add some more information because I need to provide this in a schedule, and this is part of my documentation. So where I think our limitations are what our deliverable is. And being is that my experience, there has been really limited BIM deliverables. And what I mean by that is like a model turnover. But I think it really speaks to the greater whole, if you will, to say that we don't really utilize a whole lot of the metadata as much as I would like to see. Now, I will say that there are a few isolated components you want to actually extract more information. This component delivers an end goal. Is there more information that you could extract from it? Absolutely. But is it necessary? Maybe not.
I do understand. And some of our contractor audience, they would be like, man, you gotta give us the data. We need to work with that data. Just last week, I had this big podcast discussion with Daniel Dorothy, and we were talking about LoD, and we were talking about how much data is required. And what I found out is MEP data or MEP content, either it's too much or it's too less. Like that's a frustration I've gotten from a lot of contractors. Do you have something to say about it, Navid?
Well, I don't know if I could speak about all of our contractor friends, but I would say that the scope does definitely come in mind. And there are times where the contractors, they understand, I guess, the legality of content that is covered inside the spec, and also the ones that are not. And would appreciate having information that they for sure understand you're not liable for, but they just want to see how much of that data they can use, which is why so often the data that we actually end up turning over to them might actually be more than what was actually outlined in the scope of work. We need to create sort of better understanding as to how the data gets used downstream after basically we're done with it. And also understanding that after that data gets transmitted over into the next section, whether it's being building construction, that it's understood that any changes made to it are no longer can reside as being the model that we originally handed over to them. You know what I mean? So it's kind of like, where do you draw the line on who owns that data afterwards? Like, certainly I could make a lot of data inside my content and hand that over to you as a contractor. But then can you turn around and say that data was the original data that I gave to you? So it's almost like data passing through different, hands. It almost requires some sort of a signature or some kind of an authoring to say that it has passed from this person and it has entered this stage, and this person is now the author of it, and they're now going to utilize it for such and such content. And kind of the owner, which is kind of in charge, let's say, of all this project, they also need to understand where to go back to find the importance of where that data came from.
It seems to me that we need some sort of democratization of said data inputs, or my goodness, an actual BIM mandate here in Canada to look at these things a little bit more. It leaves a lot of open doors for all of these usages and who left this window open and who opened that door, so to speak, and where that lingering information from the as-built, did it make it all the way in, and where did it come from, so on and so forth. So if we're building up this information model, definitely understanding where the source of the information is, if it's relevant, or if somebody just decided to go crazy one day and pack it full of stuff that's irrelevant. And I am not sure if it's being, if and where it's being addressed, but it definitely is a huge pinnacle point of a content creator's kind of nightmare. When there are so many questions that are left unanswered, and then I can simply turn it over to you. Okay, sure, run with it. But then they come back with a lot more questions, and it's like, well, these weren't part of the original request. Okay, now you're adding more onto it, another layer. It has to go through the next stage of modeling strategy and content evolution to make sure that that design intent is still intact.
Do you guys, when you sit down creating a fresh piece of content for a project for a client, are there any basic strategies? Is there like a workflow that you follow? Is there like a set pattern, or it changes every time?
So yes, absolutely, there is a workflow. The first place that I start, that I think no matter how much I would try to shorten it or skip it, it doesn't end up making things any better, is definitely standardizing the way you name things. So whether it's from the way you choose to name the content to the way you choose to name the metadata within the content, because it kind of gives me a bit of a start in knowing whether the piece of content that I'm going to make is really something that exists already, and I mean, like, it's fabricated, there's a manufacturer that develops it, or B, whether it's something that I know I'm going to need, and that I'm going to approach a manufacturer afterwards to be like, this is something that we need for this project, can you make it for us? It also kind of helps me kind of figure out a little bit about sort of the grand scheme of just how much metadata or I want to implement inside this content. Do I want to take it, let's say, to an LoD 400 or 500, or is this mostly just a representative sort of piece of content, and is this just going to be like an LoD 200, LoD 300? So depending on the complexity of the LoD, it also kind of sets up more sort of standardized naming information that I kind of start with in the beginning.
Dylan, what is your secret sauce for your content creation?
The first question in response to that is, am I modifying a request from somebody, or is this from scratch? Would I be building something from scratch? Then yes, absolutely. At least I can speak from where I'm currently employed. We have certain standards that we need to abide by. Graphics, naming conventions, ensuring that any geometric constraints are working properly and flexing properly. Any custom metadata that we want to tag or document or schedule is properly input. If this is already a chosen manufacturer object, then do we necessarily need to make it look exactly like that because it's already chosen? So we're just going to show a very schematic blob of geometry and pack it full of data, and it's a box, and it meets the X, Y, and Z values. We put a little clearance component on it, and then from there, just pack it full of data and refer to manufacturer spec, end of story. Or is this something like very, very unique? Like I need to create something more conceptual that needs a lot of geometric constraints and etc. And this is going to be a fabricated component. So with that said, I have my own specific family templates that I like to start with. Again, speaking from Revit, each one is usually unique, but I usually have one base family template that I start with. And then from there, I have other templates that I usually just copy paste depending on what the end goal is. And that's usually a dialogue and a discussion in itself.
One thing that I'm getting from both of you is that somewhere just in the initial process of creating content, you really need to know to what detail are we going to create this. both geometrically and information wise. Do you actually refer to any standard LODs? Like, is there like actually a standard that we can go and see that this is LOD 200, this is what it should look like?
There are several standards, which is kind of sometimes the issue is because maybe there's a bit too many standards that talk about LOD. So, and I think first of all, I want to just clarify a little bit about LOD itself. So, and Dylan, feel free to jump in and if you have a different definition of it. But from my perspective, LOD, which is level of development, actually has two parts to it, which is like LOD with a lowercase d, which mainly talks about the level of detail. And that's how much graphically you're going to be kind of creating the content. So how realistic it's going to be. And then there's also LOI, which is level of information. And that's kind of the metadata. It's how much parametric data there's going to be in there for driving this content, for making it various different sizes, how much metadata is there going to be. And both of those together kind of make LOD as a whole. You don't necessarily have one and the other always side by side. So if you could have a really simple looking box, like Dylan mentioned, which is just jam-packed with a lot of LOI, level of information, right?
Yep.
And we typically call those like placeholder families. And we have tons of boxes that just have absolutely no shape to them. But on the other hand, we also have really realistic looking, content with a higher level of detail, which don't necessarily have any information. They just kind of look really realistic. I would say that's probably the first thing to keep in mind. The second thing to keep in mind is that the content inside a specific project don't have to be the same LOD. It depends on the purpose the content is going to be serving and what is the client really looking for. Kind of keeping both of those hand in hand. I would say in terms of kind of referencing, going back to your question, there's the BIM Spark forum. They created a very good document that kind of talks about LOD. I refer to that quite often. BIM, the Canadian Practice Manual that was published, all of those have a level of details, and they are more or less around the same sort of definition for what we look for when we're talking about, let's say, an LOD 400. Typically, I would say, regardless of what is the model going to be used for, most of the content developed at our firm or most firms that I've worked with tends to be around LOD 300 to 350. Anything below that, you're looking at kind of schematic representation of content, and anything higher than that is when you're really diving deep in terms of metadata and being able to utilize that data for more, say, building automations or fabrication.
So yeah, what about you, Dylan?
It's quite often the LoD matrix, if you will, that follows a project timeline. And quite often, the BIM execution plan includes an LoD matrix and your BIM goals of what this content is intended to be used for. Coming back to the LoD, it's usually always defined geometrically. As far as I'm concerned, I don't really like these half steps between 300, 350, 400, so on. Just call it like 300 plus if you need to do it or whatever. But I understand that sometimes there might be a little bit more geometry in something that is considered LoD 300, which seems to be the kind of the industry standard. Now, that being said, that is, your condensed 2D deliverable, which is probably PDF and AutoCAD. You can always deliver an LoD 300 model for a contractor to go and do whatever they want to do with. Mm-hmm. And as Navid pointed out, it is buildable from, it is QTO buildable from. LoD seems to me a resort back to how does this look graphically and in geometry. Mm-hmm. Whereas the LOI kind of gets forgotten and gets kind of treated like an afterthought, in my personal opinion and in my experience. Now, I know that on the other side of the equation, that's what, being VDC and construction, that's what they're looking for. And whereas that's not part of, a traditional architectural deliverable.
Like I said, if there is no information, there is no BIM. Is there a single piece of content that you are really proud of?
I built a really cool piece of arrayable furniture. It's for a transit project, so NDA. but I was able to make it completely parametric, and it had a light embedded in it. The lighting consultant made different versions for depending on how long it was. So it was a panelized system. So I was able to just create a series of panels, and then it would, make a new light version, and it was nested metadata, returning strings and populating tags and schedules. Now I made all this and gave it to everybody and said, here, this is how you use it. Was it utilized to that extent? that I will negate to talk about.
Okay. So Navid, do you have something that you might have created in the past and you're like, oh man, this is my best work?
I can't really say I point something out that I could say is my best piece of work. I mean, from a MEP perspective, as you guys know, we don't really look too much on visually how things look. They're all like metadata driven, and I think our content essentially has data sheets that go along with it. So you actually, for most parts, are discouraged from interacting with the content and encouraged to interact with the data sheet that goes with the content. At the end of the day, we have this terrific model and we give it to you, and you're a contractor and you look at it, but people like to see stuff printed in Excel format, and they'd like to see PDFs and stuff. So it would be wonderful if you could say, here's like every single data sheet and cut sheet for every piece of equipment in this model. And hey, by the way, if you want to change something, just write it in here and it actually updates the model for you.
I want to jump to a possible questionnaire. So my first question is, what soil type has most ideal permeability that is suitable for construction of a sewage system? Silty sand, well-graded gravel, inorganic silt, organic clay, or high plasticity soils?
Well-graded gravel.
Okay. No, silty sand.
Oh, okay.
What is CCDC 14?
I'm just going to say I don't know.
I'm in the same boat. I think you're really stumping us with these questions, Chetna.
Okay. It is design, build, stipulated price contract. What is the acceptable maximum slope for an interior ramp that is not located in a barrier-free path of travel in a restaurant?
1 to 20.
Do you have an answer, Navid?
I'm going to go with my architect friend here and say 1 to 20.
Okay, it's 1 in 10.
Is it 1 in 10?
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
What is aluminum commercially produced from? The ore that it's produced from?
Aluminium?
Seriously? It's bauxite.
Bauxite.
So this is the last part of this discussion. You guys can tell me the rose, bud, and thorn of being a content creator or creating content on a project.
When I look at the rose, it has all three components involved. There's a thorn, a bud, and a rose. On the way up the stem, there's lots of thorns, and I would just simply say downloaded web content. Because Revit City, as great as it is for a resource, great. Use it as a resource. Don't use it in my project. Get out of here. That being said, there are great websites out there that build, things in-house, so on and so forth. And I mean, all the power to you. You've thought about the end goal. You put all your efforts into creating a complete product, if that's what you're trying to do. And good stuff. So there are good stuff out there. Now my bud, that is the designers that acknowledge the process behind the content creation. And then of course my rose would be to see that piece of content that I created utilized in its fullest capacity, with all the data being scheduled. It meets all the requirements and beyond. The extra little jewel making that rose a complete would be having the designers acknowledge the component is doing more for them than they know, because there's background processes that I've built into it that allow for different aspects of either the information or the geometry to speak to different conditions that it's set up for. And those can be either simple or complex.
Navid.
I would say the roles would probably be having sort of an industry that is really open and free, and being able to just share information, and having everyone just have the flexibility of taking manufacturer content and being able to slap on your own metadata onto it and have it represented to your model, and like really quickly you could up your game and be able to utilize these great content that's already been developed for us. Now, there is definitely a bad side to that as well. You kind of need to know a little bit about where to get the right kind of content, like Dylan mentioned, BIM objects being a great one. There's a lot of other resources as well out there. We have such great forums you can just kind of hop on, post your request of something you need or something you're working on, and you just get like tons of responses of people just looking to help you. So that's really the beautiful part in being able to work in our industry today and kind of develop content. It's just we have so much resources. The bud would probably be sort of a standardization that is kind of overseen throughout our great country of RC, Canada. We tend to be a little bit lacking in terms of adopting standards, especially typically being behind the US and Europe, and that really causes confusion when it comes to content development and content management. I know there's work being developed. We have the ISO 19650 that's in progress by the SCC, that's just kind of peeking its way through, of us having some sort of standardizations here. But it would be wonderful if we can get to, let's say, a point where, let's say, the UK or British standards are for BIM. In terms of thorns, yeah, there's definitely quite a lot. We definitely have a lot of benefits in having lots of softwares at our disposal. But a thorn that's always been there for me is just the lack of sort of manual on how to properly use these tools together. A lack of essentially enforcing collaboration on these tools. It's sort of just like a sandbox of people just grabbing whatever software that was just announced by a big developer and just running wild with it, which is good, but it just makes it so much harder because you don't know about whether the content that you're developing in this platform with these sort of criteria and restrictions are going to be the it thing next year. I love having new softwares to work with, but I really just kind of push it back on the developers to be like, is it polished? Is it clean? Is it collaborative? Does it make sense with our industry to have this? And really give us a manual. How do we use it with everything else?
With this discussion, what I'm coming down to is that a good practice of content creation is something that could produce a reliable, flexible piece of content that serves the goal it was created for. But it was nice having you guys over. I'm so happy we were able to do this. And thank you so much, guys, for taking our time and being on this podcast.
Thank you very much, Chetna.
Look forward to our next discussion.